All right, ladies and gentlemen, time to get started for this evening. It's everyone's time and everyone's at home, I imagine, probably juggling families while they're doing that, like myself. So I don't want to delay any longer than is needed. Looks like we've got a big audience tonight. There's already well over 400 people in the room, so that's pretty exciting. This is a topic pretty close to my heart, so it should be self-explanatory as we go along. One thing I will ask everybody, as you can absolutely appreciate, I imagine already from looking at your chat boxes, it will be very, very difficult slash next to impossible to answer questions as we are going through the session itself. So if you wouldn't mind holding off questions to the end, there will be a dedicated Q&A time. And obviously, look, with the numbers of people, if things can't get answered right now, tonight, or there's a request for resources that aren't in the booklet provided, please feel free to reach out. I'm happy to provide those if I can. First of all, I'd like to do an acknowledgement to country. I was lucky enough to have a great mentor in this space, and she always encouraged me, particularly when working with people who weren't necessarily from the land that you are on, to make a point of sharing something new. As opposed to doing a scripted or rehearsed acknowledgement, make it something authentic and personal. And so I just thought I'd share, because I know so many of us tonight are actually from further south in Australia. I would like to share that where I'm sitting right now is on Quandamooka country, which is on the beautiful Moreton Bay up here in Brisbane, in a little suburb called Wynnum. And Wynnum, I lived in for many, many years before it was explained to me that Wynnum is actually the name of the local pandanus tree. So those who are familiar with pandanus trees on the beach, or some people may be familiar with them as breadfruit trees, Wynnum is the name. And it always resonates with me. As simple as that story is, it always resonates with me, the beauty of names when they actually matter and actually are connected to space. And, you know, we can come along and call something anything, but having those names that actually mean something, it just makes so much more sense to me. And that's just what I'd like to share for my acknowledgement of country this evening. So the PD tonight, PD in your pocket, thanks very much to the New South Wales Family Daycare for hosting that. It's on outdoor play in family daycare, which, you know, has the potential to be a very broad topic if we didn't narrow it down a little bit. So I'm going to do that on this slide. What are we covering tonight? So the session we'll be talking about tonight will cover some important aspects of outdoor play and the play that children innately seek when offered time, space, and resources. Now, it says next that that's through a Playwork lens. Now, I didn't get a big introduction slide on purpose there because I wanted to wait until now. So as a professional, I identify, I'm titled as a play worker as opposed to an educator, which is nuanced and interesting. And we'll unpack that as we go through this evening. But I like to share that, though, because playwork practice is a profession. It's a well fleshed out, acknowledged profession. And therefore, it has its own theories and has its own perspectives. And it's always worth pointing that out from a critical reflection point of view, because many of us in the room tonight, I imagine, will be coming through a very educator lens, and that's fine, because playwork and education has immense amounts of synergy, but it does definitely have some points in which it clashes. So I'd just like to articulate early that a lot of what we will be talking about is from a playwork lens. Now, if that doesn't necessarily align with exactly your philosophy, don't see that as a bad thing, because part of our profession is, of course, to always critically reflect. So it's not about me being here tonight to try to preach and convert people to this way of thinking. It's just a way of thinking. And we'll be able to, you know, come to a conclusion at the end, whether that's something you do align with, whether it tests and challenges you, and that's okay as well. Let's have those questions and conversations now and ongoing. But this is a perspective. I've been working in a playwork way with children for over 15 years now. So the anecdote potential is quite rich there in regards to having built my thoughts around this topic very holistically in the field. And then I've had the privilege of also being a researcher and applied the theory to these ideas after the fact, as opposed to trying to mash theory onto practice. It's kind of gone the other way around. So through a playwork lens, we're going to unpack. Oh, and sorry, before I move on, I do talk there about outdoor play. And that's what we will be talking about. But playworkers value play wherever that happens. Playworkers also, though, believe in a compensatory style of practice. And if something's not happening enough, we do look at that. And I guess that's the angle there we'll be coming at with outdoor play. So through this playwork lens, we'll unpack the very aspects of choice. So choice in play, what that actually means and looks like, and how it can sometimes be misconstrued. We will talk about risk in several different ways, and we'll get to that as we get there, and affordance as a theory. And if you haven't touched on affordance or really dug into it before, it's definitely worth considering. And we will get to it, but I'll just drop a little hint. Every space has affordances. So if you're not aware of what they are, it's definitely worth considering, because these can be harnessed if we care to think about them. So all of these things considered together are needed for healthy childhood development, or more to the point, maybe that could be worded better. They are needed to have the potential for healthy childhood development, because without considerations, there a lot can go missing. So what did we learn from you? So this is an interesting slide, because this is not something I could predict, definitely not. And it's not something we really knew what the answers would be at all. And it was very interesting, actually, because leading up to the session, there was lots of inclinations towards being challenged to go outside, which is obviously where the topic idea originally came from. But the data was really interesting. So in the pre-surveys, this is from the educators. Many of you are probably in the room tonight who filled those out. So the first question there was, how often do you program for your outdoor environment? So I just want to clarify, that's not how often do you use your outdoor environment. It's a little bit different. It's how often do you program for your outdoor environment. Now that's important, because using the outdoor environment is one thing, but programming for it makes it intentional. That's not just a break from indoors. This is a deliberate and meaningful use of the outdoor space. And it's quite interesting data here. So we had a big chunk of once a days, 46%, and an equally large chunk of 2 to 4 times a day. So a large number of people. And look, 7% of people all day are programming for their outdoor environment, which is amazing. And you know, not always possible either. So I don't want to make that sound negative towards the people that don't. That's not feasible in some settings. However, that's a large number of people. So that's 99% of people do program at least once a day or more to use the outdoor environment as an actual intentional practice, which is a lot. Now, there's 1% that are never, but from a generalized point of view, that's not a lot. And I dare say, without making too many assumptions, there may be some explicit reasons for that. But that's something we could, unpack. But when you're looking at data from a scientifically generalized point of view, 99% is very compelling data. So what was the next question? It was, do you see the outdoor environment as important for the children's learning and development as the indoor environment? So as important as the indoor environment. Now, this data was really interesting, because I was like, well, 98% say yes. So I think we're done, guys. Enjoy your evening and enjoy your kids and your dinner. No, I'm joking, obviously. But that's obviously really impressive. That's an overwhelming amount of people who are very convinced that yes, the outdoor environment is important. And even the larger part of the very small bit of the pie left is unsure, as opposed to no. Very, very small fraction was an outright no. So that's a lot, and that's great, because that's a huge amount of people that can really tap into some of this theory tonight. And once again, that's a great thing. Just because you do believe that doesn't mean there's not new affirmation that we can add to that story. Now, this is an interesting one for a couple of reasons. So how often do you go outdoors each day? How often do you go outdoors each day? So this is a funny one, because it sort of conflicts a little bit with the programming to go outdoors, because 78% of people, which is a tremendous amount, always go outdoors each day. And let's face it, let's not forget that we're not talking, there's anomalies, there's cyclones and other issues that may make that impossible. But generally speaking, 78% of people always go outside. With once again, that 1% not at all, but 21% sometimes. So there's an interesting analogy to be made there, because if we go back, we've got 99% programmed to go outside every day, but 21% aren't necessarily. And once again, I'm sure there's things like weather, things like particular children, number of children, number of educators, which is obviously a huge factor in family daycare, because so many people are actually in a space by themselves. And that can, in some senses, limit stuff. And look, as a play worker, quite frankly, I could imagine a situation where the indoor play is so amazing and rich and the children are so engaged that it would be very, very unplayworky of me to necessarily say, sorry, guys, you've got to stop now, and outdoors we go. So that's fair, but it is interesting when we are looking at these data sets to see these differences. So that's the data from you guys that we can unpack a little bit as we go. But what we've got here now is a little bit of further explanation of that Playwork lens. So we did mention through a Playwork lens that we'd be talking about these topics. And what is that? And look, this is a slide that I need to have because the greater the interest in Playwork gets in Australia, it is still absolutely regular that I am in a new room of educators doing professional development or doing mentoring. And this word joined together, play work, is still not necessarily something on the radar, or it's been heard, but a deeper understanding of it doesn't exist. So I can't give you a complete training in Playwork tonight, because in the world, you can still do your bachelor's, master's, and even PhDs in this practice called Playwork. The reason I speak to Playwork with that gravity is not to talk it up more than I need to. It's just simply to say that it exists in a really big and ratified way. There's been playworkers working in the field of playwork since the 1950s. They were called play wardens and play leaders there, but the profession of playwork has been around for many, many, many decades. And because there are things like bachelor's and master's and PhDs, there's research articles, there's books, there's textbooks, there's articles, there's blogs, there's web pages, there's a million resources that you can tap into. But like myself, when I first started in this field, I didn't know to search playwork. I was searching other things and had to stumble across that quite accidentally. But have a go, have a search, have a Google, have a look through a research journal and use that as a search word, and you'll be really amazed at how much is there. So playwork is a profession. You can be qualified in playwork. However, it's tricky because some of the best playworkers I've ever worked with are playworkers by vocation. Now, Bob Hughes, who is arguably one of the most influential playworkers in the world, arguably the first academic playworker, he quite aptly described playwork as an intuitive practice. So please don't feel like this session tonight's irrelevant because there's no way that you're going to go do a Bachelor of Playwork. That's okay. I wouldn't either. It's a vocation, and we can wrap playwork ideas around the job that we're doing anyway. So as far as the definition goes, I had this one for you this evening for a couple of different reasons that I'll explain. But this definition here states that playwork is the specific act of affecting the whole environment with intentionality to improve opportunities for play. So it sounds very simple, I guess, maybe in that definition, but it's a big thing to affect a whole environment. Now, affect is obviously the opposite almost of effect. We're not looking for outcomes here. We're not looking at where things are going to go. We're looking for everything that the space does to birth these ideas, to birth improvements to opportunities for play. Affecting is the process that comes before anything else does from that point of view. And now the whole environment, that's an interesting one as well, because the environment is largely in our sector described in very geographical wording, the physical space, the corners, the equipment, and so on and so forth. But playworkers effectively look beyond just the physical space, because you're part of the environment, practice is part of the environment, weather's part of the environment, where the shade is at 3 p.m. is part of the environment. So all of these things as well can be affected to enhance the intention to play, to improve those opportunities to play. Too sunny outside all day, and if that's the reason we're not going out, we can do things about that. That's kind of the mindset there, if the intention is to improve play. Now, without going down that rabbit hole too much, I use that definition A because it's a fairly straightforward one. There are other definitions of play work out there, but also because that definition is a recent addition to version 2 of the My Time, Our Place framework. And I know that most of you will be in the early years setting, and that's okay. I'll get to that in a sec. But I know as well, because my children's family daycare did take school-age children in the holidays. So there is that potential blurring and blending of the frameworks. What's more important, though, to point out there is that, apologies in advance, we tried very, very, very hard to get that into the early years framework as well during the panel reviews, and it didn't make it. However, there is something that did, that I'll show you in a little bit, that is as important for play work in the early years framework. The other interesting thing there, though, that Australia is a little bit behind the times, because that's the first government published document that I'm aware of, and happy to be corrected on that because I'd love to read one if there is, but the first government published document that actually recognises that profession, that way of working with children in a framework context. That's really big news for play workers in Australia. The playwork principles are principles that a play worker effectively aligns to, and I'm not going to go through them all tonight. There is 8, 4 per slide, but these are something I'd love you to look at, and I do believe that they're in the workbooks that you've been given. These 8 principles are not something that I like to give lip service to. They're definitely not that laminated thing that goes on the wall that talks about pedagogy and stuff. This is something we embed in all the services that I operate, into our policies, into our quality areas, into our actual own educational philosophies as well. For those really passionate about play and children, there's not many of these that are particularly confusing. They do speak to real play, as a lot of us probably remember from our childhoods. We just didn't need principles to honor those things because we had those freedoms. But these things obviously need to be advocated for on a greater level, potentially, in this day and age, depending on where we are. So there's 8 of them. We're going to look at 1 and 2 a little bit more closely in a second. So just going through them briefly. But number 5, I particularly love as a play worker that works in a lot of loose part spaces, because it doesn't talk about creating a space and letting children play there. It talks about supporting children and young people in the creation of a space where they can play. I know that's fairly obvious when I say it like that, but that manipulatable aspect, that changeability, that ability for children to really leave their imprint on space is so important. I do love number 6 too, in regards to this PD and any other PDs you may do, because for me, it is the journey that makes a play worker. And number 6 is the play worker's response to children and young people playing is based on a sound, up-to-date knowledge of the play process and reflective practice. And that's where that intuitive practice has to come in, because we can all do a course in January and 5 years later, we can't only hold that course. And all the time that's surpassed there is irrelevant as our professional qualifications. It has to grow, it has to change, and that needs to be based on up-to-date information and reflective practice. And that doesn't always need to be formal professional development and learning. That could be a thing a child does. Like, these things are incredibly important in reframing and re-articulating and recalibrating our practice in that space. And number 8, we'll talk about again in a little bit in regards to risk. But just to introduce it, play work often gets simplified as being maybe too risky, or educators who are not particularly engaged and maybe standoffish. And that's an unfortunate and very sad definition of play work, because there's a lot of things play work, once again, from the beginning, from affecting the space we're involved in those decisions. But number 8, play workers choose an intervention style that enables children and young people to extend their play. A play worker intervention must balance risk with the developmental benefit and well-being of the children. That's a powerful statement. That's not saying it's risk over anything. It's saying that there might be, but it's carefully balanced, carefully managed, and that's not a passive occupation, if that makes sense. Now, principle 1 and 2. I promised I'd come back to those, and I will. So these are very profound for a couple of reasons. And there's a couple of things I'll touch on here before I make the penny drop relevant to your frameworks. First of all, number one is worded, all children and young people need to play. I mean, that's a bold statement in itself. We're not talking about it would be good for them to. They need to. And it is a basic human right, according to Article 31, that they have that need to play, and we should facilitate that. The impulse to play is innate. Play is a biological, psychological, and social necessity and is fundamental to the healthy development and well-being of individuals and communities. Big words. This is not an option now. So once you do psychologically sign up to this way of working with children that is called play work, this is no longer a nice to have. This isn't play, the thing that happens around the other important stuff. This is the important stuff. Now look at that last sentence there, though. Development of well-being and well-being of individuals and communities. This is big. This isn't about the moment or this isolated time. This is bigger than that. This is about the development of the capacity to live within a community, live within a society. It's all the compromises and negotiations and exchanges and even the healthy conflict and learning from that allows us to do that. A lot of people use the term free as if it's an ideal. But if everyone was completely free, those freedoms would bump up against each other really, really quickly. The actual process of being part of a community or a society, it's hard. It takes practice. But play is where human beings start to do that. And if we don't have enough play, and I'm not going to draw any profound correlations here because it is only conjecture, but we're looking at this growing number of youth and adolescents that feel disconnected from society, that don't feel part of their community. And it would be easy to imagine that with the documented decline in free play and access to it, that there could easily be a very strong link there. The next one is principle number two, which is also really important for a couple of reasons. First of all, it's linked to the penny drop moment coming up. But play is a process that is freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. That first sentence there in particular is very important because in play work, that has become, in most cases, the understood and accepted definition of play itself. Now, let me do that again. Play is a process that is freely chosen, personally directed, and intrinsically motivated. Now, what's powerful about that statement, and this is where I like to go deep with my critical reflection, and particularly when I'm critically reflecting with my teams, is I love that that definition doesn't talk about the what the children are doing. It's not the thing, the isolated, programmable, outcomes-focused thing that the children are doing. The process, it's the process and the motivation behind the thing the children are doing that makes it play or not. Now, that's really interesting if you think about it, because playing with loose parts, looking at the clouds, finding shapes, painting a picture, reading a book, playing tag, playing with the ball, any of these things, therefore, by that definition, could be play, or they might not be. And that's a little thing that we need to reflect on a lot. If it doesn't meet that, it's not play. So what are we providing then if it's forced? And even if we think, by the way, from an outcomes-focused point of view, that this is what everyone wants to do, is it? And that's a really powerful question if it doesn't meet that criteria. Now, moving on. So what is the link to FDC? So this is a little penny drop here. So this definition here is, you will notice now after seeing that last slide, principle 1 and 2, play. This is a definition of play. Play is fundamental to the healthy development and well-being of individuals and communities. That sounds familiar, doesn't it? It is often described by a range of characteristics, including freely chosen, self-directed, pleasurable, meaningful, symbolic, and intrinsically motivating. So freely chosen, self-directed, intrinsically motivating. That sounds very familiar as well. So this is the new definition of play that is in the early years framework, and this came as part of the version 2. Now, it's not accidental that that definition sounds a lot like Playwork principle number 1 and 2. That was due to a lot of work behind the scenes to ensure that a very authentic, holistic, and real definition of play was in that document. Isn't it sad, actually? I always reflect now, because I've never really, maybe I didn't give it enough thought in hindsight, but I don't reflect enough that before version 2 came about, there was no definition of play in the early years or school age framework. There was only a definition of play-based learning, which is lovely, but it's something quite different too authentic play, just play for play's sake, and not even a definition of something called free play that a lot of people talk about, because you can also make an argument from a play work perspective that if it's not free, then it's not play. So play is as simple as we need to be in that setting. So choices, so what? So what? Angus is rambling about all this stuff. So what? So if choices are important, because freely chosen suggests that choices are, if choices are important and define the very being of play, then where did most children like to play? Because that's a really important question. If we're going to try to plan for a space that offers amazing choices that children are going to intrinsically, to use that word again, gravitate to, we probably want to have a clue what that is, and not overthink that too, because kids can surprise us, but at least have a clue. So the next little list of places I'm going to share with you, and this is actually quite challenging online, I'm not going to lie to you, because it's quite fun to try to pluck these from the audience, but it's going to be a little bit tricky to do tonight, and for time's sake, and that little trick will just carry on. But we're going to go through a list, and it's an ascending order list of a lot of compiled research. And when I say compiled, a lot of different research projects that have been merged together into a list of places where children have identified in research that they like to play. I want to stress, so no one gets potentially offended, I don't think that will happen anyway, that this has a lot of variables, because there are anomalies, there are variables in different locations that make some of these spaces flip around in their hierarchy. But as an average, as a mean, this is where children around the world like to play. So number one, and this might surprise some people, but number one on the list, and by the way, number one, so we're at the low end of the spectrum. And by the way, at the low end of the spectrum, that still means that a lot of children said that this is where they like to play. Places that they don't like to play are not on the list, but ascending order. So schools, early learning, and OSH. That's a little bit sad, isn't it? Once again, though, of course, there are many, many, many places out there where that is much higher up on the list, depending on the circumstances of that space. And I hate to say it, because I don't want to offend any school teachers out there, but school, if it's broken away from early learning and OSH, also usually features a rung down from those other places that definitely have a greater focus on recreation, leisure, and play for the children. But schools, early learning, and OSH, they feature, they're important, but they're down at that end. Next are public parks and playgrounds. And that surprises a lot of people, and actually surprises a lot of researchers, that it's on there, but it's not super high. But there are reasons for that. There are reasons for that. And I think the reasons will make a lot of sense to the people of around my age group that had a little bit more freedom in their childhood. So public parks and playgrounds, and this is a particularly Western trend, are becoming less and less about the green space at the end of the street that you can just kick off down to with your mates. Because if that was the case, these spaces actually feature quite highly on the list. Unfortunately, though, due to various council initiatives and prerogatives, a lot of public parks and playgrounds, particularly playground design, are becoming about destination playgrounds. So very, very big and fancy spaces that you have to go somewhere to get to. The problem with that is the child has very little choice in that process. It's a decision that's made that will take them there. The amount of time that can be spent there is discretionary. It's not really necessarily your crew, the kids in your street. It's a lot of random people. If there's not enough for the adults to do, the visits can be short, and so on and so forth. So those kind of considerations affect that data. If there's a really great place in a cul-de-sac at the end of the street with a creek and a piece of grass, and the kids can go there themselves, guess what? That features quite highly, but this is generalized data once again. The next one, which actually is interesting that this features higher than playgrounds, is pathways, greenways, streets, and pavement. So that features very highly, once again, when children have access to them. Pathways was a really interesting one in the research, because you can imagine that for a lot of children, and who has a memory like this, where it was really the getting to the place, the riding your bike or walking with your friends or jumping over the creek, or all those memories predicated the enjoyment of the adventure rather than, and we're here. So those spaces feature quite highly as well. Friends and relatives' houses, they feature quite highly, believe it or not, above all the others, because you've got connection there. you've got community there, you've got people to play with, which is a really important factor of any of these spaces, I might add. And there's a novel value when the house isn't yours, there's other stuff. But surprisingly, above the novel value, your own house. Their own house features very, very highly. And this is largely attributed in the research to things like my stuff's there. As simple as that sounds, my stuff's there. It's where I've got attachment. It's where I've got security. You can really be yourself often in those spaces. And that features very, very highly as well. Now, the one that I really love, because it really brings me back to my childhood, is wild spaces. And I use that photo for a reason. That's my children down at one of our local wild spaces. These are places that children love to frolic in, to play in, to explore, because they're a little bit more unknown. A playground at the end of the day is a ladder and a slide and a monkey bar and a swing, and you'll play there. Absolutely, you'll enjoy that. But it's a more of a known commodity. There's something in the mystery and the exploring of wild spaces that children really love. Now, these are all places that children like to play. And that would be what the list would look like if the data was 10 to 15 years old. Unfortunately, and I'll mix my bias with that soon, unfortunately, something else has crept in quite prevalently in the last decade, and that is screens and devices. Screens and devices now feature extremely high on lists when children are asked the important question of where do you most like to play. That in itself, by the way, if you ever are doing any critical reflection, is an important nuance. If you ask children what sort of playgrounds do they like, it leads the brain down a direction. If you want an honest and an authentic answer, the question is better asked, where do you most like to play? It sounds so similar, but it obviously opens up a realm that is cut off by just talking about playgrounds. So screens and devices. So what? We're going to ask that question again. So what? So some data. And this is important because we are talking about tonight outdoor play. In 2023 Child Health Poll, Australian families, how we play by the Royal Children's Hospital shows less than half of Australian children play outside most days. Less than half play outside most days, which is great, right? Because in your data, we're pushing back against that in our sector because clearly a lot more than half do that, and that's important, but we should definitely champion that. The poll shows that children are being kept indoors because of a lack of time to supervise them, safety fears, and the lure of screens. So there's contributing factors there. The lure of screens, though, is absolutely one of them. Supervision and safety, understood. I actually perfectly understand that because we do need to manage that. Lure of screens, we'll see. So physical activity has been shown to be important for children's immediate social, mental, and physical health, as well as protective health across the lifespan. So this is one of those beautiful things that we always need to reflect on in our sector, is that we want to give children the most amazing experiences when they're with us. And that goes for early years all the way through to school-age care. But it's one of those Band-Aid ripping moments where we've got to realize as well that what we're also doing isn't about their immediate enjoyment necessarily that day. We're building up bigger things that are going to go potentially psychologically and physically for the rest of their lives. And we're probably not going to see that. That's that great enlightenment meme, you know, like the enlightened man is the man that plants a seed for the tree that he'll never see grow. It's literally the same thing. We've got to have that mindset about creating these spaces that will lead them, read that again, as well as protective to health across the entire lifespan. That's huge. And a lot of that is on us, parents as well, community as well. But if they're spending a lot of time with us for a couple of years, that's an incredibly important time. So if physical activity is that important, then it's also interesting that time spent outdoors is one of the most consistent predictors of children's physical activity. Universally, more time outside is the most consistent predictor of children's physical activity. So what does this imply? Bad screens? Screens do all the damage? Well, we're going to come back to this list. If choices are important and define the bean of play, then where do most children like to play? So if these are places that children would play, how many, and this is a big question, how many in many suburbs now in Western culture in Australia, How many of these spaces can children regularly access intrinsically of their own will? And that list is going a lot shorter. Even the public parks and playgrounds, if they need to be taken there, that's not something they can just do. Pathway, greenways, streets, and pavements, not necessarily. Maybe friends and relatives' houses, but it's limited based on, once again, being taken and so on. Their own houses, yep, that's absolutely fine. But what's in their own houses usually? Also screens and devices, and wild spaces, not so much. So what I'm getting at here is that it's not necessarily, despite my data-driven dislike for screens and devices, we can't really blame the screens and devices per se. Now, I grew up having access outside, and that's a lovely thing. We can't necessarily guarantee that. There's a million reasons we can't just go, Angus said all this, just open the gate and let them go. But in FDC settings, we have opportunities to create the sensation of wild spaces, to create the sensation of green spaces, even pavements. Think of hopscotch on the concrete, so simple. We have opportunities to recreate some of these things to push back against the screen and device addiction. Now, once again, I'm so empathetic to kids on this space. People always expect as a play worker, I'm going to be, technology's the devil, but frankly, kids can interact with their peers now. I mentioned before that peers are a huge part of this equation. If you're not allowed to go down to the park, if you're not allowed to go down to the creek, if you're not allowed to run down the street to your friend's house, but you do have an iPad where your friends can communicate with you, of course, that is the most tempting option. So it becomes really important to try to compensate for that and create opportunities where they can do those things away from that screen. So what else do we do to support? So as a community, as a society, as a people, we do know that physical activity is good. We know this. It's in all the data. No one's confused by that idea. However, we sometimes overcompensate as opposed to taking the play route. And we do more things like more organized sports as opposed to just playing. We do more structured activities, and that happens a lot. I mean, I've worked in schools where they do the mandatory run around the oval before school, and it comes from the right place. Do not get me wrong, but it's not intrinsically motivated. It's not what constitutes play and where children get most of their activity from. Children's gyms, I don't know how everyone feels about those, but I've seen a lot of those chain gyms open up that are literally for 0s to 5s. I don't think they do aerobics classes, but still, it's a destination playground at best. Let's just say that. And I'll tell you a story about these organized sports. I was working 15 years ago for a state school. And I know this is a school age story, but guess where your kids are going very, very soon, the ones in your care. And data had been released that year that showed that the cohort of children coming into prep were the most sedentary cohort that they'd ever had, the most sedentary cohort they'd ever had. And frankly, like from a play work perspective, I was kind of like, well, these kids need to go play. These kids need to go move and to climb some ladders and all that sort of stuff. The decision was made, though, that they couldn't because they were sedentary and they weren't allowed to engage with the playground on the site, which I couldn't quite logic out, but I could not logic out the actual plan for that sedentary cohort, which was mandatory rugby league training for everybody in grade 2. I honestly didn't know how to process that. Let's just do nothing for 3 years and then mandatory rugby league training in year 3, because that'll solve all the problems, and everyone's going to want to do that, right? So these are the extremes we go to, and once again, hand on heart, well meant. It's about getting physical. It's about doing things, but is it the best way to do it? So some more data for you. It can be argued that among children, active free play or unstructured physical activity that takes place outdoors in the child's free time may potentially be a major contributor to children's physical activity. Better, for example, an observational study in the US found greater amounts of physical activity amongst preschool children occurred as active free play rather than structured activities. Now, that is Bailey et al., but that is consistent in Scandinavia, in Europe, in the UK, in longitudinal studies where when they observe children over long periods of time in either forced physical activities or play, and by the way, play means they could be sitting down doing not much, but over a longitudinal time, the play always wins for physical activity, and being outside increases that possibility. That's important, and we should definitely think about that. So, what's stopping us? And then, by default, time. Time is a big one that comes up again and again and again. And that's something I'm really looking forward to the interview video that we have in this PD this evening, because time in early educational settings is usually something that comes up as a challenge when I'm talking with educators because of the perception of what else they have to squeeze in. So the framework stuff, if we've got to do all that frame, and by the way, that gets a lot worse when they get to school, but in an early years context, the framework and the expectations and the outcomes focus and the learning stories and all of that, once, if there's a little bit of time at the end of that, that could be for play. So time can be a problem. Perceptions in play work is another huge one. And to be honest with you, in most of the consulting I work in, a lot of it's perception busting. So the perceptions of things like risk is a legitimate one because I don't want kids to get hurt as well, but it's a perception and we can manage that. Play value is a huge one. And it's sad, but it's true. But there is just a large cohort of people that don't see play as particularly valuable, or it creeps into our vernacular accidentally, and we start talking about play as the thing that happens around the important stuff. That happens a lot. A classic example of that is a school example, but I think everyone will appreciate it. Once you start talking about playground duty as the thing you're doing when you're supervising play, the brain calculates that as, yeah, it's the thing I have to do instead of have my lunch, or something like that. But it doesn't give value, it doesn't give honor to the actual play that's happening. And obviously, and this has been part of the surveys, although it does suggest that most of you actually do value, but outside versus inside as a learning space. And not as a play space, not as a usable space, but outside versus inside as a learning space. And last but not least is choices. That comes back to the outcomes focus again. If the choices aren't there because we've decided on one thing that we think will be exceptional, well-meaning, as once again, it just might not tick the box that gets children along that really, really good play avenue. So what does that look like in our outdoor spaces? So the next little bit is our interview with two amazing FDC educators, and we had a really good time. We went a little bit over time, actually, because the conversation was so rich. So I'm going to share this video with you now, and please, take it in, learn from the crew, because we really unpack this a lot. What does this look like in their spaces? How does the outdoors matter in all of these contexts? So thanks for giving up your Sunday afternoon to do this interview for our upcoming session. Can I first, I guess, just briefly ask you if you wouldn't mind introducing yourselves to the recording, and we'll move on from there.
Who do you want
Tash,
to go?
would you like to go first, or?
Sure. So I'm Tash. I am one of the educators with Camden Family Daycare through the Camden Council. And yeah, I've been in the industry for about 16 years, working in centres, schools, and now family daycare as well.
Fantastic. And Alison?
Yeah, same scheme as Tash, and I've been an educator for about 21 years with the same scheme. Yeah, that's my story.
The first thing I'd like to ask you today is, how do the outdoor spaces in your services make you and your children feel? So beyond the activities, what's actually the feelings and the sensations that they get out of those outdoor physical spaces?
I think when we go outside and when we're engaged with our my environment, the first feeling is just regulation, because in the mornings especially, I can have children arriving anywhere from 7 a.m.
Yep.
So when the bulk of the children arrive between 8 and 8:30, it can get really like full on, and everyone's not very regulated at times. So we've been going outside. We've been outside by 8:15 some days, to just and as soon as we step out, it's like a calming feeling comes over all of us, including myself, because an unregulated adult cannot regulate children. So when it's all happening, like the outside environment really does help regulate all the emotions.
I love that we've touched on regulation already, Alison. That's an awesome contribution. So thank you very much for that. And Tash, did you have anything to add?
Yeah, I definitely echo what Alison was saying. When we take out the kids in the morning, it's immediately calming. You might have had a really crazy drop off where everyone's come at once and it's like, okay, everyone's got to sort of adjust. Or, you might have had a slow morning or whatever your morning looks like. The moment that you step out and they're just immersed in nature, it's really grounding. It's really just that calming effect is instant. And you sort of just want to soak it all up. And, my service, we've got predominantly boys and they just always want to be outside. But we've got to come back in, whether it's rest time or toileting or things like that. They just immediately want to go back outside.
No, I like that we've kicked off with this actually because a lot of the feedback we had leading in was that people actually found going outside can be sometimes, not always, but fall into the too hard basket. But I like that immediately you sort of flip that to being like, well, actually, it could actually be the thing that does away with things being too hard. And that's a bit of a mantra we're working on a lot at the moment is this idea of regulation before education or regulation before structure. And across the board too, from family daycares to long daycares and right into schools. It's a real paradigm shift for people, but it's getting across that notion that, well, you can have an hour and a half in a classroom or an educational setting that could be a struggle, or you could have 45 minutes of regulated productive time and the rest of it outside. I mean, what would you prefer to do? Time in class is not necessarily the thing that equals learning. It's productivity and being regulated while you're there. So no, that's awesome. I'm glad that you've acknowledged so clearly for everybody listening that the outdoors has an incredible capacity to do that without explicit probably instruction. It's a very innate thing.
That's Angus, that's really right with also I guess to the point of an outdoor environment doesn't automatically assume like nature, as in it could just be your grass grounding you, the air, the wind. So it doesn't have to be, and I think when you touched on some educators put it in the too hard basket, the outdoor environment doesn't have to be a convoluted, massive scaled thing. It can literally be grass, some cardboard boxes, some loose parts, and let them go. All open-ended, and the structure comes from the children then working with the resources.
Yeah, I like that sentiment as well. And Alison, I'm a huge fan of loose parts, so I'm glad you've given them a mention. And they'll feature in my in the presentation that will precede this. But as an educator, I actually love the days where it's not convoluted, but the children end up doing something that I could simply not have planned for. They're the days I sit back and it's just so satisfying. But you have to be real with yourself there and realize, well, if I couldn't have planned for that, then no lesson I was ever going to do, or even provocation of the loose parts could have achieved that. It just had to be authentic and holistic like that, which is letting go a bit. Is that fair to say? And just appreciate what comes from that. I think this will be an easy segue, to be honest with you, to the next question. But the question was, do you see the outdoor spaces just as important as your indoor spaces? And I think we're leading the way here to say that that's probably going to be the case. But would you like to elaborate on that idea? Because once again, we see, and we can all picture this, right? We can see an over curation of indoor spaces, the sections and the resourcing and the intention that we can't always see. But there's an over curation of the indoor spaces and not so much the outdoor spaces sometimes. But and maybe we don't have to, Alison, over curate the outdoor spaces as we've already touched on, but is it safe to say that you'd both then see, though, the outdoor space as equally important to the indoor?
Yeah, I'd say either equally or even more important because, these days kids get picked up from daycare, from school, and a lot of them, they just go home and they're, sort of inside again when they've been inside for majority of the day, especially if they are at school. And so getting outside and spending that time outdoors, I would say it's more important because of those mental health benefits and those physical health benefits. Any learning can be taken outdoors, and just having that mentality can really change a lot. So yeah, I actually feel like it's probably more important, probably more on that end.
And Alison?
I think as Tash touched on the emotional, and as parents are very busy, they pick up, they go home, dinner, routine, bed. But something I had jotted down was about I would class being outdoors as more important, and only because when children are outdoors, so when you're inside, it's very regulated. There's no, you've maintained a temperature, you've got your aircon on, everything's maintained. But as soon as the children walk outside, they're experimenting with different weather conditions. They're having to be resilient and resourceful with their resources, i.e., if they're building with blocks on the grass isn't a stable foundation, so it may fall over. So when it falls over, what do they try and do? They go, okay, what do I do now? Or the wind may blow it over, or it might start raining and things might start getting wet. So all of these things help to build resilience and capability in the children, which you're not going to get indoors.
No, I love that a lot. And to elaborate on that too, like sorry, just had a little momentary glitch there on my screen. The idea of more important is an interesting one, and the session that preceded the interview talks a lot about play work, because play work is the practice and the way of working with children, which I follow. But one way in which play work is often defined in its foundation forms is as a compensatory practice. And how I interpret that is I don't necessarily value the indoor over the outdoor for children's play, because children will play wherever there's children. However, as a compensatory practice, if we do know that children are going home to be very indoor, very sedentary, very away from other children, that makes, therefore, from that play work perspective, my compensation to offer these children this, enriching childhood that we want to do, that would obviously therefore tilt towards outdoor play as the thing that I want to offer them. And let's face it, I mean, I know this is such a cliche thing to say, but I grew up on the street, on my BMX, at the park, at the creek, and so on and so forth. It's really easy to take that for granted when we know that's just not the case for so many of these kids now. So compensation side again comes in there. Like, what can we do? We can't necessarily offer them that, but what's something else that we could bottle and offer that gives them the same feelings, the same sensations? And we are talking about feelings here in the outdoor environment. So I thought that was a relevant segue as well. The next question is an interesting one, because this is where I think, and this is from feedback that I've had from a lot of educators, this is where the too hard basket situation can come into it, because the idea of opening the door and letting the children out doesn't sound hard, does it? I mean, that seems very, very straightforward to me. But how in your services do you take that idea, and Alison, particularly that idea of not overthinking it, because that's where people struggle a little bit, I think, and tying those ideas to the relevant frameworks in your service, as far as documentation and quip links and all those things that everyone loves, don't we know it? But how do you achieve that? Because I think in that is the thing that makes people nervous with the whole, I think you just let them do it, because it doesn't seem like it's planned, but obviously we can be more intentional with that idea.
Yeah, do you want, well, I'll go first.
Please.
In regards to that question, my main thing that came to me was it doesn't have to be hard. Like when you say, but see, again, I guess for educators, all our environments look different. So sometimes opening the door might be, okay, so all the kids have to be outside at the same time, because I can't supervise people outside going to the toilet. So everyone has to move in a group, possibly to go to the toilet. I'm lucky that I have a very open play space. So, and I've got windows, so I can see pretty much if I'm changing a nappy, I can still see outside. So I am lucky in that respect. But in regards to the question with the approved frameworks, I think, children's assessment of learning looks so different for all our services. So children should be involved in their own assessment of learning. And the photos play a big part. Like, I have a book that's children's voices and contributions. So in this, the children put all their work, and then they can go back to that and they can analyze their play spaces and go, and then they look at it and go, well, let's rebuild that, or let's go back and do that. So they have complete ownership of their learning in all play spaces, but we're focusing on outdoor. So that's one big thing. ELF and QS are the foundations, but giving the children their own voices and contributions is so important.
And that does link beautifully to the framework. So thank you, Alison, because I think, that the word agency gets thrown around a lot, but really understanding what that word means, I think, is crucial to being able to make these links and really justify that if they take it a different direction,
Doesn't matter. Like
I'm not worried. In fact, fantastic.
yeah, we're all high-fiving each other when like, a child decides to do something different and they're like you see this wow moment go off in their head. And I was always taught like by a lady I used to work with to be purposeful, intentional, meaningful. And for every educator that wants to set up a play space, just remember those three words, because if it's not purposeful, if it's not intentional and it's not meaningful, why are you doing it?
Yeah.
Yeah, I
So
couldn't agree with you more, Alison. That's a fantastic way to summarize that. That should be
yeah,
maybe that's the new framework we need to be working on.
purposeful, intentional, and meaningful. Like it's,
Yeah.
but when you break it down to those three words, how easy is it? And just the wow moments, they all link in with each other.
Mm. Being good with language is important, I've found too, because really understanding what those words mean. And intentional is a huge one for me with loose parts, for example, because we actually, as an educator, can have an opportunity to define what the intent is. And I see people get put on the spot with loose parts a lot because I mentor in this space a little bit, but the intention can be that they're nothing. That is the intention, because then if they're nothing, the children can take them in any direction. And
Make
that's
it
my
something.
intention. But
Yeah.
people can, it can trip people up because it clearly sounds like a question that says, well, what's it going to be? What's the plan? What's the outcome? And sort of unraveling that outcomes focused way of thinking to, once again, the intention. That can be a very good little bit of dialogue to have up your sleeve, because no one likes being put on the spot with these questions.
No, no, but it's so open-ended too, because loose parts isn't just, I think 10 years ago, we all thought about loose parts as being small beads, screws, like little things in a tinker tray, whereas now they're open-ended experiences, boxes, wood,
Yep.
pine cones, like anything that is open-ended, it doesn't have a definitive meaning of how to be used, is a
Yep.
loose part.
100%.
So
And yeah, look, the larger stuff too, as you said, the smaller objects that used to be and look, if you still go to Pinterest and so on and so forth these days, that will be the dominant
yeah,
loose parts you'll see. Simon Nicholson, who wrote the theory, though, first and foremost states that loose parts should be space forming. So children should be able to create those nooks and crannies and caves and dens first before the smaller parts get transported in and the really magical play happens. So that really sort of breaks apart that idea of little trays and little bits.
yes,
Not to say those things aren't important, because they can contribute to the really imaginative play that comes next. But that space forming capacity is really powerful, and children in all cultures and in all continents do that same thing. And once you can beautifully generalize something like that, it becomes even more powerful, because clearly that's something we should be offering children, if this is the thing children do wherever children are, if they have the time, space, and resources. Small tangent there, I apologize. But Tash, did you want to talk to the frameworks and the NQS as well, in regards to how you do make this open-ended outdoor experience linked to this?
Yeah, I guess you got two parts. You got your activities that you're providing, and then, you're governed by NQS and the EYLF. And so obviously you have this big area of safety. And, when you're talking about outdoor play and risky play, even the loose parts play, you can find sometimes educators are really hesitant of unlocking all of that and actually really delving deep into it. And, you know, I think if you really set the foundation with your children, slowly introduce things, um, you can open up incredible doors where you see different levels of learning that you haven't seen before. And so that's something that is really big here. My backyard that we have here for the kids, it's actually quite small. And so, when I first opened, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with this space? I ended up just getting the kids to design it with me. And at the time, we were going out doing lots of nature walks. And, I just found having them involved in that process of designing the space and what they wanted in there, just based on what we were already doing out in the community, it really empowered them. And, we've got like I still have babies here as well, and we still have all the rocks and the pebbles and the logs and all of that stuff is all outside, and we have the loose parts. But coming back to I guess more the NQS, where you're talking about safety and that, you can still provide those opportunities. and it's supervised. You're there with them, you're educating them on how to use these things as well. So still going off on the loose part tangent, because I loved that was brought up, because that's something I'm really, really big on.
It's not too much of a tangent because the session preceding the interview will speak to loose parts very specifically. So it might actually be quite a great segue.
Yeah.
And you mentioned risk, and I think risk for me is another one of those things that can make that too hard basket, just to use that term again. And there's a great Playwork mantra around that, which is effectively that we do provide children with managed risks to keep them safe. And it sounds like a very throwaway comment, but if children have no experience, we've been able to identify, engage with, and obviously at an age-appropriate supported level, of course. But if they've never had these experiences and all of a sudden they're meant to be young adults who can tackle and manage all this stuff for themselves, having been denied it since early years and onwards, it's a fallacy. So it's really on us in that, once again, that compensatory sense to at least expose them to stuff that they can identify, work with, make decisions about, and we can scaffold the support around that. Now, just in the event that we don't want to go too much over time, isn't 15 minutes such a tiny amount of time to have a conversation like this? But I did want to ask in relation to the NQS and the frameworks specifically. And Alison, you've shown us a great example already with your book. I really appreciated seeing that. But there are other ways that you document this, specifically your outdoor play. Are there any innovative, different ways that you can do that really shows that intention, purposefulness, meaningfulness?
Well, again, taking it back to the children's lead. So within NQS, obviously we have risk management and things like that. Well, the children in my service, they did the risk management for the loose parts. So the wood, the tools, that area, we sat down and we worked out what we needed to keep us safe. So the children came up with the shoes. They needed enclosed shoes on because in my environment, they don't have to wear shoes, but in the construction area, they need shoes on. Someone came up with, we only pick one piece of wood up at a time. So they molded the risk assessment for that area we did that as a group. And we also did that as a group for our worm farm. So that, going back to NQS and ELF, that's including the children, but staying within the rules and regulations that we have with risk management. So instead of me just going, okay, guys, you need this, this, and this, you can only do it this, this, and this way, they contributed it. And by them contributing to that, they now have ownership.
Yeah, I like any risk benefit and risk assessment done like that, Alison, because I like to think that if we do manage it all ourselves, well, what happens when we're not there? Whereas when they're involved in the risk taking, remove the adult, and they still might think,
but they're also,
I need to do stuff here.
Yeah, but you hear their conversations of, oh, you need to put your shoes on. You don't have your shoes on. You can't pick the wood up, or don't pick the wood up like that. We have to pick it up. Like, we have to be safe. So as soon as you hear those conversations within the children, you know that it's actually been, because they've created the document, they've absorbed the information.
Well, to use assessment and rating language, it's obviously embedded when you start hearing that from the children. But we do talk a lot about rules, and when children co-create structures, it just becomes culture. And that's what you want in that culture, is that such embedded, innate understanding of it, that it's not the piece of laminated plastic on the wall that you have to refer to. It's just the thing you do. And then they remind each other, as you say, they remind each other of that culture, which is a really great thing.
Yeah.
What about you, Tash? Any key documentation styles you love in this space?
Yeah, so quite similar to Alison, we do a floor book as well. We do a lot of project learning. So my program's a little different in the sense that every day is a fresh page. It's a blank page. And so once children all arrive in the morning, we actually have a session called our Talk About the Day. And so the children actually write the program for the day, and they choose what they want to do, what they want to get out of it, what they want to research or investigate, any particular activities they want to do. And then it's my job to step back and then facilitate those learning opportunities and what they're going to get out of it. So yeah, the children write the program, and then each week they might add to that floor book as well, just showcasing what what they've learnt, what they've discovered, what they've researched or investigated. Yeah, any photos they want to add, drawings they want to add.
Yeah.
And that is our program. Yeah, we just
Fantastic.
yeah, and as Alison also mentioned, if a child's really engrossed in something and they're, showing all these new skills they haven't done before or really learnt something that's quite huge for them, rather than going away and doing your observation and then programming for the next week or the next month, we extend on that on the spot. And it's still documented. We, still do our observations, things like that. But yeah, I'm quite same as Alison. I'm really big on doing things in the moment and just making it really purposeful rather than,
That's how play works, doesn't it?
yeah, that's right. They might come next week and they're like, oh, I don't want to do that anymore.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
you've gone to all this, trouble programming and writing and
Yeah, and that for me is fundamental to play work. When we get to outcomes focused, it can create a bit of a disjunction between the adult and the child relationship because the adult's now fixated on wanting to see that thing, and a week later that might not be that kid's thing at all.
that's right.
So that's a really great point. Look, guys, we've gone a little bit over, which is okay. So just to finish up, I wanted to ask you, because this is something we can address in either the footnotes or the session itself, but if you could give me the biggest barrier, and I know we've definitely innately just touched on some anyway as we've gone, but the biggest barrier you think is out there to educators getting outside more and embracing and really harnessing that space. What do you think the biggest barrier would be?
I think this was something that Alice and I chatted about the other day. I think weather can often be the biggest barrier for some educators. And I'm really big on all weather play. If it's, a 35 plus degree day, obviously it's way too hot. And so if you don't have that shelter or there's not that breeze to sort of, help cool it down, then it's probably going to be too hot to go outside. But in saying that, if it's raining, you can always get gumboots, raincoats. I've always provided that for the children here. We've got gumboots, raincoats, and even the wet weather overalls. You can get them online, Kmart, Target. They sell all of this as well. Or you can even get families involved and get them to bring them in and just leave them at your service. But honestly, the rainy days, my kids cannot wait to get out there and to have their raincoats on. Even on Friday, we've been project learning lots of bugs and insects. So we've been finding a lot of them in the garden, and in our bush tucker garden, we've got lots of caterpillars and that at the moment. And so outside we had this big trough kind of going, and they added their large river rocks. They clipped off some of the plants and the fruits and the berries and all of that, and they popped it in and made a little habitat. But then it started raining, and so they looked up and they're like, and one of the kids said, "Oh, it's just water. It's just water. We can give the bugs some water." So they went and got their raincoats. They already had their gumboots on. And we just continued up until like lunchtime, and so that was probably about 10 o'clock, and they actually stayed at this activity for almost 2 hours, and had their raincoats on. They were more than happy.
It's a carbon copy thing I hear, that educators identifying longer periods of time engaged in outdoor settings as opposed to indoor settings. That's not empirical evidence. This is just hearsay from what I do get told by educators, but I think it's worth sharing because there's got to be something in that.
Yeah, absolutely. And, having those extended periods and it's uninterrupted and you're just really going with their lead is so valuable, because I feel like it just unlocks this other part of the brain where they're just going deeper and deeper and deeper into their thoughts, into their curiosities. And yeah, if you're out there for 15 minutes and it starts raining, like, oh, got to pack up, got to come in, then that's all interrupted. And you can't actually take advantage of that moment. And that water from the rain turned into, a bit of science experiment as well. We ended up getting all different things to add in. And then at the end, we also had, your bicarb and your vinegar and bubbling all the insects and watching them sort of, which they loved, mixing with the water and having all of that, sensory output as well.
No worries. And Alison, biggest challenge you think?
Yeah, as Tash said, like we had a bit of a talk. Like I've got to say, when I actually thought about this question, I think one is fear. I think one is fear to set up an environment that may cause an incident, may cause an accident. Like what we can't control everything. We can only risk manage what we can and know. So what I had written down was like, we've got, raincoats. Like, don't be scared to ask your parents. Just on enrollment, I say to my parents, bring your raincoat. I need a raincoat and a pair of gumboots that stays in a wet weather box, that stays in care. But also sometimes raincoats are quite inhibitive. I know that when I wear a raincoat, I feel a bit closed in. So I always give the children the choice. If you want to put a raincoat on, you can. If you don't, that's okay. When you want to finish playing, we can get changed. So that then, as soon as you say to a child, you must have a raincoat on, they go, I don't want to wear a raincoat, so I'm not going to go and do it. So they're then therefore possibly missing out on a opportunity to be out in the rain, as long as it's not torrential and hailing and crazy town outside.
Of course.
But if it's just like a light rain or even, medium to heavy, they're only getting wet. So it's no different to them using water play in a sensory aspect.
Children don't melt.
No, and I'm a big one for not forcing like paint shirts on. We do not use paint shirts. They paint in their clothes, because as soon as you say stop, we need to put a paint shirt on, as Tash said, the moment's gone. So for that child to stay in the moment, like they've got to play-based learning, which is something that we all need to be like, that's where children learn. That's, as you've said, that is the focus of where children learn. They cement their skills, they learn their skills, they impart their skills to their peers. It just needs to have a flow. And if educators can get that flow right from indoor to out, outdoor to in, that's where the magic is. That's where it happens.
Fantastic. And flow is a great thing to research anyway. Ladies, I appreciate your time. I'm going to have to be a timekeeper, which I hate because discussions can be so rich. But we have gone over, which is fine. But I really do appreciate your time on a Sunday. I look forward to putting all this together and for it to be part of the session coming up in a couple of weeks' time. But once again, thank you very much. It sounds like your program's amazing, by the way.
Thanks, Angus. Appreciate it. Thanks, Tash.
Thanks so much for having us. And
but once again, thanks to the girls for that amazing interview. It was really nice and chatty actually, and wasn't totally on script, which is good though. I like going down that row. Towards the end of the interview there, on top of a lot of other good stuff, there was an innate touching on in the conversation of a concept called flow, and that word was even used. And a lot of the sensations and the experiences that were articulated in some of those stories, and the reason there was a reluctance to interrupt these beautiful moments that were happening, can be closely attributed to this theory called flow. And the diagram on the board shows this quite easily on the screen, sorry. So the premise of flow in regards to this thing called risk that we've touched on a few times now, but exists in a lot of other capacities as well, is this premise that when a challenge is too high for a child, if you can see the left-hand axis there, and a skill is too low, children fall into that quadrant of anxiety. However, if the challenge is too low and your skill is too high, boredom. And this is something that often happens in settings where things have been overly predetermined, because we can't predict necessarily exactly where children sit on that left and that right axis. However, through intrinsically motivated play, children balance that really well for themselves most of the time. And they do this with loose parts, but they also do it in other forms of play. Children like to play at the edge of their capacities, and that's why that flow diagram does actually go diagonally up. But they generally take off bite-sized chunks that they can process. And in behavior management conversations, you can also appreciate that a lot of behavior that's negative that we need to manage often comes out of either anxious or bored children. So maintaining that flow state for children is ideal. Now, the interesting thing about that flow state, though, and the reason I tapped the slide in after the interview, was going back to that Playwork mantra and that definition of play, intrinsically motivated. Flow cannot be achieved unless it's intrinsic. It can't be forced, it can't be manipulated, and it can't be made to happen. It has to be intrinsic. So that's an important reflection in itself, to allow children to get to that state. For fun, by the way, the theorists who devised the theory of flow. His name's Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi. try to if you have a look at that written, it takes a while to get it to roll off the tongue like that. But he defines flow as that thing that you did for an hour that felt like 10 minutes. We all have that capacity, and flow state's an amazing place for the brain to be. It's both therapeutic and recuperative, and also an optimal learning state. But that thing that you do for an hour that felt like 10 minutes, and I feel for kids, that's really good play when they're engaged. So when I say risk in play work, I actually break risk, play work as a profession breaks risk down into three distinct understandings of risk. And this is where we can myth bust as well and push back against this idea that play workers are riskier in their practice, and actually make a case that we think about it a lot more. So as opposed to standard risk management plans, play workers use a combination of understanding risk versus hazard, and that is a distinct line between a hazard being a risk or a danger that children do not have the capacity yet to identify, make decisions about, engage with, if that makes sense. It's just a hazard. Now, a hazard can be removed from a space physically. A hazard can also be removed by making children aware of it, pointing it out, giving them tools, giving them scaffolding to engage with it. That turns it into a risk. So a risk, of course, is one of, something that has a potential for danger, but children can see, they can make decisions about, they can learn about, they are aware of. Now, once again, this is not to suggest that we're pushing unnecessary, very, very dangerous risk into our settings. And if you go down to playwork principle number 8, I told you that we'd come back to it again. Playworkers choose an intervention style that enables young people and children to extend their play. Playworker intervention must balance risk with the developmental benefit of well-being of the children. No benefit, no well-being benefit, something that we can't manage, we don't do it. But if we can make smart decisions around the engagement with it, and there is a strong benefit, how do we know if there's a benefit? Well, that's the next point, risk-benefit analysis. If we have a robust risk-benefit analysis, that gives us the why to do the activity. And this is where risk-benefit analysis trumps risk management every day. A risk management has the risk and how to manage it. A risk-benefit has the benefits, the risk, and how to manage it. This is the why. Why would you do an activity that has risk if it just has the risk management? The risk-benefit makes that critical. The process of dynamic risk assessment is the third in the tier, and that is the actual practice. That's what we do in the field day by day. That is a complex and nuanced process, and not one that we can squeeze into an hour and a half PD, but it is definitely worth researching. There are some good resources out there, but dynamic risk assessment allows us to ask questions. It allows us to differentiate. It allows us to ascertain different environments at different times and actually make decisions, which we can't once again do if we're constrained by a black and white template of we do this when, if that makes sense. So what do we gain from managers encountered with risk? Because we want to know that. We might need to advocate this to stakeholders for our documentation, for our quality area 2, and so on and so forth. So quite simply, we gain the capacity to learn to risk detect. Now, to me, that's so important, because we all agree normally in rooms that the next point there is to manage risk. Who doesn't want children to be able to manage risk, to make smart decisions, to overcome, to avoid, if necessary, whatever is needed to be safe? How can children do any of that growing up if they don't know how to even detect a risk? The catch there, though, is what does an environment need to have for children to learn to detect a risk? It has to have something that is at least enough of a risk that they need to stop, think, calibrate, make decisions, and we can support them in that process. It also gives the capacity to harness neurological activity for survival. So when engaging deliberately with risk, children experience adrenaline. And that's a healthy thing to do. And some people never lose the desire to do that, but most of us need it in manageable doses. Now, the interesting thing about play in neurology is that when we engage in play-based engagement with risk, we get the adrenaline. When we engage with risk and danger that is not intentional and not in some form controlled by us, and by control I can simply mean our willingness to engage with it, we get a lot of adrenaline and cortisol is our stress chemical. So the idea of this is that we want to harness the ability to default to adrenaline, to act quickly, to act smartly, to be strong, and all these things. So that becomes our default as opposed to cortisol, flight, or freeze becoming our default. And once again, we learn that in play. This mantra I mentioned in the interview, but play work, providing risks for children keeps them, there's a typo there, I apologize, providing risks for children keeps them safe. Now, that sounds like a throwaway statement, but we cannot be safe in the future if we don't have the capacity to manage, avoid, change, and so on and so forth, risky situations. So affordance theory was another one of the key ones that we mentioned in the introduction. And affordances, I already hinted at, are important because your spaces have them anyway. Your spaces are full of affordances, whether they be dull affordances or really exciting ones, they exist. Every physical space actually has affordances of some sort. So affordances represent real and measurable possibilities, but always in relation to the individual that recognizes them. So the important thing for our environments is they need to be varied, because it's up to the individual to actually perceive, interpret, and engage with an affordance. We can't necessarily decide or know that for them. So affordances can be seen as clues from the environment that invite actions. So consider them as potential play cues for, to kick off play, to get kids excited, to engage them, and so on and so forth. Now, an example I'll give you about what a space says is an adult version, just so we can all relate to it together. And it's an example that I requested and was given permission to use from Mark Armitage, from a PD that I did with him many, many, many years ago. And it pertains to how a room is actually set up. And the picture there is a hint of where this is going. But once again, this is usually done in a different setting. But if you were to go to a professional development setting and you walked into the room, and all the tables were set up in like lecture style. In fact, there's no tables. The whole room is full of chairs facing the podium. That would tell you something. And that would tell you that the expectation of this session is that we'll be sitting, we'll be facing forward, we'll be listening to a speaker. If the same room was set up, exactly the same room with the same furniture in it, the tables are being brought back out, there's chairs around the tables, and there's some paper on them. It's exactly the same room with exactly the same furniture. There's been no verbal instructions. There's been no written instructions. You would have an expectation, and that expectation would be because of the affordance. The room is saying, we're going to be doing some group work. We might be talking. We're going to be sitting together with a group. We might be writing and all that sort of stuff. Now, if the same room, however, all the chairs and tables were pushed back from the middle and the lights were dimmer and there was a disco ball in it, that would tell you something different again. Once again, all of those instructions that I've been through, though, none of them came through explicit instruction. It was what the environment said to do. It's what the environment offered in regards to how to engage with it. What do your environments do in that regard? Now, they will do something, but it is worth critically reflecting on it, because we can change that, we can enhance it, we can harness it for the betterment of improving play, which is that role, once again, of a play worker. So environments are inundated with them. You can't stop that, but be effective with what those affordances are, as opposed to taking them for granted. So we can think about the outside as so much more. The list on the left there are some examples of how we can harness the affordances of a space by adding mystery. So mystery is that idea that we don't always know what's going to be there. So in a sandpit, for example, one day there might be gems or crystals or gold coins. Now, as a play worker, I do love planting mysteries like that. But the key there is when children are looking to you, which they're very much trained to do these days, to like, oh my God, how did this get here? It's really satisfying to be like, I don't know. And let them maintain the mystery. Let them create a story, a narrative, a whole tale around that. The ability to discover things. Changeability and adaptability is important. They sound similar, but changeability is your ability to change the space. So to ensure that it remains novel and interesting and engaging, that might be week by week, that might be term by term. You know your children, I don't. But the ability for that space to change is important for children in the same environment for a long period of time. Adaptability is about their ability to do that. So their ability to engage with and change the space, which is important as well. Appropriate risks, we've touched on that enough, but they should be in the space. There's an affordance to that. There is an affordance that creates caution, engagement, and all of that stuff. And last but not least, choices. We've said that before, but choices are important, because in a lot of research, it shows that it is less about the thing that we think kids want to do. It's more about the number of options they have that making environments really stimulating for children. So optimal resources for flow and affordance, loose parts. And I said it in the interview, and I guess it was always going in that direction. Loose parts are incredible for optimizing flow and affordance. Loose parts are nothing, and by default, they can be anything, therefore, in play. Now, think about that in regards to what affordances they offer. If they can be anything, then it doesn't matter what the interest is at the moment, what the story is, what the show they've just watched, what the experience they've had at home that they want to replicate, whatever that thing is that is going to effectively guide them to the play that's going to be meaningful for them, the loose parts can do that for them. And also consider what that means in regards to flow. If children are balancing those skills versus those challenges, and can I also point out, and I should have on the flow slide, that does refer to physical space, but flow also refers to the ideas and the narratives and the stories that children are bringing into those spaces, because they are also balancing a level of understanding versus skill in that context as well. And when they can manipulate and harness the space to recreate the worlds they live in to play, they can do that really, really powerfully. So loose parts are funny, and I added this slide a while ago because it kept coming up anyway. And this can ruffle feathers, but we're just going to go through this from the perspective of the actual theory. And I'll make a really clear case on that so we don't feel, judged or anything like that in this context. So the pictures on the right there are all Pinterest pictures. And I mentioned Pinterest in the interview as not always my favorite source of loose parts motivation. And the comments on the left there are comments that plague the loose parts Facebook pages for ideas around what loose parts should be. Very strong opinions too in that regard. Now, the good news is I'm not here to share my opinion. I'm just going to check up these against the theory of loose parts and see how it stacks up. So the number one there is better if all natural. So loose parts are better if they're all natural. Now, I understand where that comes from. That comes from a really well-intentioned mentality around sustainability and nature being good and so on and so forth. So I 100% understand it. And it leads to pictures like the one on the top left there and maybe the one in the bottom middle being exemplary examples of loose parts. The problem is that the theory states that the ideal optimal loose part spaces are spaces that allow children to recreate the worlds in which they live. Now, we have a lot of nature in the world in which we live, but we get into cars, we drive on roads, we drive past houses, we drive past malls to get to the places that we go to care. That is a big part of children's worlds. And if they're going to recreate those worlds meaningfully in play, they should have a variety of man-made, natural, big, small, colorful, dull, all of this stuff, if they're going to have a really good opportunity at finding that flow, of having good affordance and so on and so forth. Set up as provocations. I think we've touched enough now on the effective approach versus effective. But just to go to the theory, that picture on the bottom right there, that's not a loose parts setting. Now, I only criticize that because it comes from a loose parts page. I am not criticizing the setup itself. So please take note of that. If that is a deliberate activity or learning example for children to learn about measurement, to learn about weight, to learn about quantity, and so on and so forth, any of the above, what a lovely looking provocation and lesson. It's just not loose parts, if that makes sense. Very expensive. Look, loose parts has become a buzzword, as the next dot point implies, and that allows it to be commodified. When you can commodify something, I can tell you that loose parts are amazing. You should definitely get them for your services. Here's my catalog and here's my $5,000 package. It happens. It happens a lot, but expensive loose parts are very difficult for educators to give wholeheartedly over to the space and the children. The best loose parts are the ones that are scavenged and sourced for free or very, very cheaply, because it's much, much, much easier for us to take that back seat of allowing the children to take those in any direction. And we can remove our agenda, which is difficult, not impossible, but difficult to do with very, very expensive loose parts. And last but not least, a buzzword. It's not new. It's gained momentum probably because of social media, but loose parts theory was written quite a long time ago. and we'll talk about that. So what are they? Straight from the theory, in play loose parts and materials that can be moved, carried, combined, redesigned, lined up, and taken apart and put back together in multiple ways. They are materials with no specific set of directions that can be used alone or combined with other materials. Very, very, very wordy. I don't love it, but it's the definition from the theory. The second sentence, though, is our real key there. Materials with no specific set of directions. To go back to the pictures, we can clearly see that's not always the case, either in how they're meant to be stored, in what we're meant to do with them, and so on and so forth. Now, the other interesting one here is the idea that they can be used alone or combined with other materials. Because loose parts have become buzzy, there is a bit of a myth going around that, they have to be all arbitrary. We can't have items with a purpose. But the theory doesn't say that. And a classic pot is always a good addition in a loose parts environment. It's not technically a loose part. It has a purpose, and it's usually used for that purpose too, making potions, cooking dinner. Children are incredible, and a pot can occasionally be a helmet. So that's an object being used as a loose part, but generally speaking, a pot will do something like its intended purpose, if that makes sense. And that is fine. I've seen a pot pull together 30 other loose parts into an amazing story, an amazing experience. So that object had a great use combined with the loose parts. Just to extend on the loose parts theory briefly, not too briefly, but I just want this to be a big point of critical reflection going away, because this is going to enhance affordance, and this is definitely going to enhance children's engagement in space. But there you have, loose parts theory was written in the 1970s. It was actually 1971 by Simon Nicholson. He's a very interesting theorist because he takes all of his theory from observations in the field. And I always value theorists that do that, because it's what they've seen versus a concocted theory that they've then tried to prove. It's observationally based, just like our roles. Now, what Simon Nicholson said was that first and foremost, loose parts should be space forming. So the first thing kids are going to want to do is build their caves, their dens, their cubbies. This is actually a scientifically generalized facet of play. Wherever you go in the world, given time, space, and resources, children will do that. They'll use materials to build caves, dens, cubbies, bases, caves, castles. They've got different words for it everywhere, but it's the same basic biological drive. And it happens inside too. People blow up their lounge room to make a doona and pillow fort on a rainy Sunday. Who doesn't have that memory? Now, space-forming materials can intimidate people because obviously that implies I can't see them. The space on the right-hand screen there is a space that the children have formed. It's 3 milk crates and a red sheet, and their body language is really important there too. So having enough of those nooks where they can detach themselves, but I could sit 20 meters away and observe them, and I'm not concerned. They're in their world doing what they need to do. Nicholson also states that once they build their dens and their cubbies, that's where the little stuff becomes important. So going back to those Pinterest pictures, that little stuff could be really useful, especially in combination with the spaces if the children have designed them. They'll take them in and develop really imaginative, creative, deep play in those settings. Now, one versus the other, just to have some critical reflection. Classic backyard, what's the affordance of that space? What's the affordance of that space? And I'm not saying it has none. But it's it's limited in regards to children being able to bring themselves to that space. But it's a lovely backyard. The next series of photos are from one of my favorite family daycares, and these are all one backyard, and it's not a particularly big space, but careful consideration has been given to the layout, the corners, the nooks, the spacing, the divisions to create these magical little pockets for children in these settings that has huge affordance, huge potential for play, and enough aspects of risk-taking for all of these things to be matched together in a really, really beautiful playwork setting. This is the most established playwork setting that I know of in a family daycare context. And Kathy, who runs the space, is an avid playworker for the record too. So those theories aren't accidentally applicable here. There has been a lot of consideration going. And there's some other photos from the space as well. You can see a lot going on in a very typical backyard setting. You've got to be willing to give it over, though, I guess, is the catch there, which is a legitimate challenge. And I've had those conversations plenty of times with family daycare educators, because empathy given. It's also your home. So there's a balance sometimes to be found there. So bringing it all together. So we have some time for some Q&A. Outdoor spaces and the outdoor play they promote are crucial for children. I hope we've established that, if nothing else. Playwork or no playwork, outdoor spaces and outdoor play are critical. This manifests not just as what outdoor play offers, which is obviously important, but what it pushes back against. If it pushes back against things like sedentary behavior, like overuse of screens, not saying there's no place for screens in the world, but an overuse of, then what it pushes back against is equally important. The enhancement of space and practice is crucial to outdoor play being successful. It needs to have those affordances. It has to have that desire to be engaged with, so flow can be found. An appreciation for risk, affordance, and choices is critical to that enhancement. And last but not least, from a biased playworker who loves loose parts are an amazing resource as they support flow, a balance of risk, and they have infinite affordance and endless choices when provided as per the actual theory of loose parts. So questions, what I'm going to do now, and let's see how my tech is working for me tonight. I'm going to stop share so I can come back to the room, and I'm going to try to scroll all the way down here, and I can't see anybody. I need to work out how to change my setting there. Here we go. Well, I can't see anybody else. I can only see me. That's very, very boring, but here we go. All right. Were there any questions? I have a question box here. Okay, someone had to put kids to sleep. That's okay. Thank you. There's plenty of thank yous, so I do appreciate that. There's a lot of people logged in tonight, so it's very hard. I mean, I wish I could do this all in smaller settings with you, but still, you've given up your evenings, and I respect that. So thank you so much for that. I'd love to document in the moment, but I'm having trouble getting my head around what it looks like. How do I get started? That was Jackie. Thank you for that question. Look, documentation's a tricky one because I think the only risk with documentation being prescribed is that the person that prescribes it to you might not understand you. I don't have a perfect answer for that without some deeper reflection of my own. I do think that documentation has to be played with until you find the way that works for you. I know that doesn't really answer your question. I apologize, but that's one thing I learned in documentation really early with the teams that I support and mentor, is that if I tell them how I do it, I don't always get the best result. So brainstorming, finding multiple ways, not being constrained to one way as well. One day it's a sketch, the next day it's a note. All good. It's still documentation, and that's powerful. So that's probably how I'd get started. Actually, is play with some ideas and don't be set on one. Try mapping the space. Try drawing things. Try writing notes. It's all documentation. Once again, none's more meaningful than the other, but if it's more meaningful to you, you'll be able to do a lot more with it. There's a comment about babies and toddlers. So toddlers in particular. So consider flow as an example, because I realize there's a lot of other concepts today, but flow is once again balancing challenge versus skill. So there's a sliding scale there, and that's why flow is so great in multi-age settings, because we're not constrained to a black and white yes or no. So the simple fact is, and for lots of different reasons, toddlers, their balance of skill versus capacity is just slightly further left down that channel, but it grows. So if the space is rigid, it won't progress very quickly. But if they can engage with it dynamically, they have a greater potential. I always consider dynamic risk assessment when I'm talking to people about toddlers when they first start taking their first steps. It's the best example in early years settings because it's something we intuitively dynamically risk assess straight away. We know they could fall, but we're not going to stop toddlers from starting to try to walk. We can all accept that, yeah, even though there's things we need to do to support them, but that just upscales to all sorts of other things that children engage with. There is a risk, but it's incredibly important that they have the opportunity to overcome it, to move on, to grow and develop. Thanks for all the information. You are most welcome. Lots more thank yous. Claire gave a great example there. So Claire, I hate to say this to you. It says here, what do you do if children build something that is not safe? That's one of those deep dives into dynamic risk assessment that we just didn't have time for tonight. But please maybe hit up the organization that hosted this, and I can send you some documentation on that. Within dynamic risk assessment, there's a lot of strategies to support children in exactly that space, because them understanding that it's not safe is part of that learning as well. It's not to say we just leave it and go, oh, I think play works, that we just stand back and let them build something safe until it falls over. That's not the process. But they're going through the motions of understanding why it's not. And you know, put it this way, if they never get a chance to build anything, then they won't ever learn that process. But there is a way to do that that is not a 5-minute answer. I apologize. A few people maxed out on time. I'm not sure about that aspect of Zoom. I apologize. I'm not the actual host this evening. There's a few questions around contact details. I will talk to the organisers. I think when the booklets go out and stuff, there will be an opportunity to do that. There's quite a few. There's also someone asked about, was it recorded? I did see it was recorded. Once again, I'll talk to New South Wales Family Daycare about how to access that. I'm sure it's possible, or it wouldn't have been recorded in the first place. So I will look into that for you. And I'm sure that will come in the post notes anyway. And lots of other comments around thank you and thanks for the useful information. It's showing up as going through the replay. Okay, excellent. These sessions are always uploaded in the next few days. So thank you, Claire, for sharing that information. So it will be available if anyone needs to go back through and take on board more information there. So no problems with that. And the recording is still going, so the questions will be as well. I did get one question, actually. Here we go. What could you suggest is the most crucial elements for an environment with a smaller outdoor space? Johanna, that's a really great question. And what I've found in many times is that you'd be surprised how amazing a small space can be with loose parts, especially when it has space forming capacities, particularly in FDC settings. There's not usually dozens and dozens of children. So the power of a nook, the power of a corner or a cave or a den or a cubby is really amazing. And it just doesn't actually need that much space. Sometimes it's in the lack of big space and the nature of small space that makes it exciting. Children that build dens and cubbies rarely take up the whole backyard. It's all about those corners. So yeah, that's, you know, a small space with these capacities actually becomes even more useful than a small space without. But I get the paradox there, because sometimes it can make a small space feel cluttered, but it can actually absolutely be enhanced. Well, thanks, everybody. You know, it's your evening, and I realize it's daylight savings where a lot of you are, so it's even later. So once again, thank you for the engagement and the questions, and hopefully the books you'll receive are useful. And if you do need any further resources, research articles, whatever you need, please do find the way to reach out, and I'll happily provide that for you if I can. But yeah, look, have great evenings, and thank you.